With the new NBA collective bargaining agreement in place, which includes a host of changes between cap aprons, contract-related changes, draft changes, new in-season events, there is a lot to like and maybe not like about the new CBA, which will be in effect for the next 7 years. But there are a few changes in particular that will effectively reshape the future of the NBA as we know it and could have unintended consequences that might have been overlooked. What changes that, you might ask, among the host of changes made in the new CBA? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy this type of content, feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It means a great deal to me to help this new channel grow. And about 89% of you watching are not subscribed, so let's see if we can get that number down a bit. Now, as I'm sure most of you saw, the NBA and NBPA agreed to a new collective bargaining agreement through 2029, and in the agreement it had significant amount of changes as it relates to player contracts, salary cap adjustments, luxury tax adjustments, a new in-season tournament, which I am not a fan of and think it's one of the more gimmicky things we've seen the NBA implement in a long time, but maybe we'll save that for a different day. We also learned that players will now have the ability to promote and invest in sports betting companies as well as cannabis companies, the first of its kind in any of the major sports. Players will no longer be tested for marijuana, and we also learned that there is a new minimum games played threshold in order for players to be eligible for any of the big regular season awards such as MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, All-NBA selections, etc. The minimum threshold being 65 games, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the implications that will also have on the future of the NBA. But none of these are going to have more of an impact on the future of this league than the changes that were made to the highest spending teams and their ability to spend high amounts on their payroll while also having the mechanisms in place to add talent to their roster by way of trade exceptions, mid-level exceptions, and getting free agents off the buyout market. And the biggest of them all being this right here. For teams that exceed the second cap apron over the luxury tax line, they will no longer have the ability to trade first-round picks that are more than 6 years out. Other teams would still have the ability to trade picks up to 7 years out, as has currently been the case for a while, but the last season will be restricted to only teams who are below that second apron. In addition, these teams that are above the second apron cannot make trades in which they will take back more salary than they send out. Now, why is all this significant? Like, come on, we're talking about a 1-year difference in their ability to send out future first-round picks in a trade. And you're telling me they can't make trades in which they would take in more salary than they would actually send out? There were already restrictions on that to begin with. It's just now it can't even be more than $1 that they would take in versus what they would send out. Well, here's why all of this is significant. You know that massive blockbuster trade that happened just a few weeks ago at the NBA trade deadline, the one that sent Kevin Durant, a top 5 player in the NBA, to the Phoenix Suns, who already are stacked with talent? Yeah, that trade wouldn't have been able to happen under these new rules starting next season. It wouldn't have been a legal trade because of the fact that the Nets were able to send out 4 future first-round picks for Kevin Durant, the last one being 7 years out into the future. And the Suns were taking in more salary than they were actually sending out. And often the additional first-round pick could be the make or break in a deal trade between two parties, especially when you're trading a superstar player like Kevin Durant. For those that don't know, the NBA prohibits teams to trade first-round picks in consecutive seasons due to the Stepien rule. There are workarounds, of course. You can do pick swaps, but because of the Stepien rule, teams above the second apron will no longer be able to shell out 4 future first-round picks if pick swaps are not included in a trade. The maximum number of picks they would be able to ship is 3 first-round picks, because anything more than that with the Stepien rule would be 7 years out into the future. That is huge, especially when you consider teams having traded away first-round picks for fringe-level all-stars like it's candy. It is going to be significantly harder for teams to trade for a second superstar or even a third superstar for that matter. Like, the ability to create a super team with ease without drafting and developing said superstars is now going to be a thing of the past, because teams that already have a superstar are paying the tax, or near it anyway, and in order to bring in another superstar by way of a trade, it is going to cost you a significant amount in draft capital, where you're going to need to include that 4th first-round pick 7 years in the future. And again, when you also take on a superstar player who is likely on a max contract or super max contract, you're taking on considerable salary, and now you're no longer able to take in more money than you're otherwise sending out. And at that point, you're talking about overhauling your entire roster just to ensure you're at least equaling the salary you're sending out in a trade. Remember when James Harden was traded to the Brooklyn Nets, creating one of the biggest super teams that was expected to win multiple titles? Yeah, that trade also wouldn't have happened under these new restrictions because of the fact that the Nets were already paying well over the tax, which wouldn't have allowed them to send the Rockets for first-round picks, one of which being 7 years out. Harden not getting traded to the Nets Kevin Durant not being able to be traded to the Suns. And this also doesn't factor in teams and their ability to send out cash in a deal that would otherwise be an unbalanced trade, as teams usually send out cash in a trade that is considered to be unbalanced. That's right, this is yet another restriction on teams that are above the second apron in their ability to include cash in a trade, which usually favored extremely wealthy owners and high revenue generating teams like Steve Ballmer and the LA Clippers. Now, most will agree that the NBA has become a players' league. Player empowerment, especially for the top level stars, having the leverage and power to dictate where they want to play and demand trades if they're unhappy. You've seen it countless times in recent years, to the point where said superstars hold their team hostage and even sometimes refuse to play until they are moved. But now, a player can kick and stomp all they want about wanting out of their current organization, but the team, simply put, will have their hands tied. They're not going to be able to get a deal done with the limited options they have in draft capital and salary constraints if you are above the second tax apron. Say Luka Doncic demands a trade in the near future, which, given everything that's going on in Dallas and the possibility that that team could miss the play-in, is a likely scenario. But say he demands a trade. A superstar, franchise level player, quite possibly the best player in the NBA in the near future, simply put, Luka will not be able to demand a trade to those teams who are spending a lot of money and going over that second cap apron. The Mavericks, if forced into a situation where they had to trade Luka, because I don't think the Mavs would ever willingly want to move Luka Doncic, but if Luka was demanding a trade and they needed to move him, he's going to have to settle for a team that isn't paying the luxury tax, which, to be fair, is still quite a few teams. He and the Mavs would have options to make a deal work, but there is no chance he would be able to force his way onto a team with already one or two superstars and creating this insanely talented super team. The new CBA makes this incredibly hard to do. Now, what I will say, I actually like the new rule changes that are being made for the highest spending teams that find loopholes to still add talent to their roster above and beyond the exorbitant amount of money they already have committed on their payroll. To be able to maintain some level of parity is good for the league, with the notion of super teams controlling the NBA with just a couple of teams being considered true title contenders was starting to become prominent in the league up until a couple seasons ago, making it significantly harder for teams to construct these star-studded rosters because they have the money to do so, while smaller market teams suffer as a result, is great when you consider the disparity between the league's bottom feeders and the elite, with talent consolidated in just a handful of teams. That being said, I don't think teams should be penalized for trying to create the best team possible no matter the cost. Like, if anything, coming from a Bulls fan who has gone through decades of ownership trying to cut costs and nickel and diming players to save a few bucks by not paying the luxury tax, I don't think that type of behavior should be rewarded. But at the end of the day, a level playing field, parity among the league, is better for the NBA overall, and the new CBA will be making super teams a thing of the past. Now, the other thing that will significantly change the course of the NBA for the future, or at least as long as this rule remains in place, is the 65-game minimum threshold to be considered for the NBA regular season awards. Some might say, whatever, this really isn't going to mean much. If anything, this will limit the increase we have seen across the league in load management and star players sitting out games to conserve their bodies for the postseason. But this is actually more substantial in that it has massive contract and salary implications for certain players, as Supermax extension eligibility is tied to individual awards, such as All-NBA selections. For example, and this information comes from Sam Quinn of CBSSports.com, who put a great article out on this. I'll leave a link to that in the description if you're interested. But last season, there were 4 players who were selected to an All-NBA team that played less than 65 games, who would be eligible for a super max extension, but going forward would not be able to be selected to an All-NBA team, thus would not be eligible for a super max contract. To add even further to that, the following players are all going to be ending their season playing less than 65 games this year: LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard, Steph Curry, Ja Morant, Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Devin Booker, and Paul George, all players who are considered superstars in their own right, but would not be eligible to receive the NBA's biggest individual awards and strip their ability to obtain supermax contract extensions. What makes this even worse, with the exception of players who will benefit from this rule change, with injuries on the rise, players resting in back-to-backs, you're more than likely going to see more random or questionable players being named to All-NBA teams. Like, if all of the players I just mentioned were not able to be selected to an All-NBA team because of this requirement, you might see guys like Anthony Edwards, Jalen Brunson, Jaylen Brown, or even Zach LaVine be selected to All-NBA teams, whereas they otherwise would be players you would not think as all NBA caliber guys, who would now be more expensive players given their supermax eligibility. Thus, a seemingly sensible rule change under the CBA to get star players to play in the majority of their regular season games is actually going to have unintended consequences where some players are probably going to be grossly overpaid, whereas they would otherwise not be deserving of getting an All-NBA nod under the prior rules without the 65-game minimum requirement. As such, these changes as it relates to the limits that are being placed on the highest spending teams, especially as it relates to trade restrictions, and the new 65 minimum game threshold for individual awards are drastically going to change the landscape of the NBA going forward as it relates to player movement, parity across the league, and some players being far more expensive than what they're worth simply because they met the 65-game threshold. But you let me know what you guys think. What are some of the biggest impacts the new CBA will have on the NBA for the future? Let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.